Hi everyone. Let me begin this video by congratulating all those who gave it a try by appearing for the latest INI Set July 2021 session. Because irrespective of the way you felt about the question paper, attempting as many exams and as many tests as possible would be the best way to assess your level of preparation with respect to each and every one of those 19 golden subjects. And it's not just that, racking up your brain at the peak of an adrenergic drive which you get in an examination hall to recollect answer to a particular question would be the best active recall exercise you can involve yourself in to establish long-term memory. So take time to pat yourselves if you had attempted the latest INI Set July 2021 session before we start discussing the 13 biochemistry MCQs which appeared in the same session. And objective of this video is not just to give you a solution or a key to each of those 13 questions, but also to tell you the relevant facts and related concepts in detail. So the assurance which I can give you all listeners is, if you manage to watch the video till the end, you will definitely get 20 must-know concepts and 50 must-know facts. So without much delay, let's start discussing MCQs one by one. So the first question is, which of the following techniques uses RNA? Now let's exclude choices one by one. The first choice is Sanger's technique. What is that we know about Sanger? Sanger was the first person to sequence DNA, and to sequence DNA, the method or the technique which he used was Sanger's dideoxy NTP method. Yeah, it is Sanger's dideoxynucleotide triphosphate method or termination method. And at this point, I would also like to stress on the fact that Sanger did not only sequence DNA first, he sequenced even protein first. And the protein which he sequenced first was insulin. And for sequencing insulin, the reagent which he used was 1-fluoro-2,4-dinitrobenzene. Now coming back to Sanger and genetics, Sanger sequenced DNA, not RNA. So I'm going to exclude choice A. Now how about choice B, reverse transcriptase PCR? We know transcription is DNA to RNA. So reverse transcription is RNA to DNA. So what do we do in reverse transcriptase PCR? We take a single-stranded RNA as a template and we use an enzyme called as reverse transcriptase, which, as the name indicates, uses a single-stranded RNA as a template, and it converts it into, or it synthesizes a DNA as a complementary strand. Now we have RNase H, and this RNase H removes the RNA template. The same reverse transcriptase also has got DNA dependent DNA polymerase activity. So using this single stranded DNA as a template, it synthesizes the other strand. So this is the first step wherein we convert single stranded RNA to double stranded DNA. Then on, we use this double stranded DNA as a template and we amplify it multitudes. So that's called as reverse transcriptase PCR. So reverse transcriptase PCR starts with RNA. So answer to this question would be choice B. And the clinical significance of reverse transcriptase PCR is that COVID-19 diagnosis is done using reverse transcriptase PCR. It's basically a reverse transcriptase quantitative PCR or reverse transcriptase real-time PCR, where we first convert the RNA of SARS-CoV-2 virus into a double-stranded DNA, and then we amplify the double-stranded DNA and we check the viral load. But because it's a semi-quantitative test, we are not giving it as a viral load, we give it as either positive or negative. Yeah, that's about reverse transcriptase PCR. And before we start discussing the next question, for completion's sake, let me tell you about choice C and choice D, Western blot and Southern blot. Southern blot is used to identify unknown DNA fragment. It is used to identify unknown DNA fragment, and it's named as Southern blot after the person who invented this technique. And if you're using the same principle, but for identifying unknown RNA fragment, that's called as Northern blot. We're using the same principle for identifying unknown protein, that is called as Western blot. So Southern blot involves DNA and Western blot involves protein. And both these do not involve RNA. So we are excluding those two as well. And the answer is choice B, reverse transcriptase PCR. Now question number 2, enzymes are used as diagnostic tool for many disorders. Yes. Which of the following is or are right combinations of enzyme markers and relevant disorders? Let's look at choices one by one. The first choice is beta-glucocerebrosidase and von Gierke's disease. First, about beta-glucocerebrosidase, it's shortly called as beta-glucosidase, and defect of this enzyme causes Gaucher's disease, not von Gierke's disease. So let me tell you a few facts about Gaucher's disease. Beta-glucocerebroside is a component of RBC cell membrane and WBC cell membrane. So once a cell lifespan gets over, we know they get degraded by reticuloendothelial cells present in liver and spleen. So in liver and spleen, after these cells get degraded, the beta-glucocerebrosides would accumulate, causing hepatomegaly and splenomegaly. Splenomegaly progresses to cause hypersplenism, and that causes pancytopenia. So that's one feature of Gaucher's. And hepatomegaly initially will be just hepatomegaly, then it progresses to liver cirrhosis. And neurological impairment is a feature of Gaucher's disease. And because there is also accumulation of beta-glucocerebrosides in bones, it causes osteoporosis. So Erlen-Meyer deformity, Erlen-Meyer flask deformity is a feature of Gaucher's disease because of the accumulation of beta-glucocerebrosides in bones. And once these beta-glucocerebrosides accumulate, they'll be engulfed by macrophages, and in macrophages, beta-glucocerebrosides accumulate like fibrils. So on light microscopy, these macrophages look like crumpled tissue paper. So those are called as Gaucher cells or tissue paper cells, which are characteristic features of Gaucher's disease. And on chronic accumulation of beta-glucocerebrosides, we know lysosomes start releasing their enzymes out. And those enzymes can be used as markers for this condition. And few markers include alkaline phosphatase, TRAP. We know TRAP is tartrate resistant acid phosphatase. Tartrate resistant acid phosphatase is one marker which is elevated in Gaucher's disease, and this was asked in AIIMS. Chitotriosidase. Chitotriosidase is also a lysosomal enzyme which gets released in Gaucher's disease, and this is particularly used for assessing prognosis in Gaucher's disease and to find out response to treatment. And this reminds me, we know Gaucher's disease is one disorder for which enzyme replacement therapy is available. Recombinant DNA technology based synthesis of beta-glucosidase is possible. So enzyme replacement therapy is available for Gaucher's disease. So these are the facts which we need to know about Gaucher's disease. And about von Gierke's disease, we know it is type 1 glycogen storage disorder, wherein the enzyme which is defective is glucose-6-phosphatase. Glucose-6-phosphatase is an enzyme of glycogenolysis and gluconeogenesis. So when that enzyme is defective, this disorder would present as hypoglycemia. So this is a wrong combination. Now how about choice B? Lipase and pancreatitis is a perfect combination. So we know pancreatitis diagnosis is made by estimating amylase and lipase, and the difference between amylase and lipase as markers is amylase is a non-specific marker because it's elevated even in salivary gland tumors and in gastritis or gastric tumors. So it's not specific. Amylase is not specific, lipase is specific. And the other difference between the two is earlier to rise would be lipase. So lipase is more sensitive than amylase. But the one drawback of estimating lipase and pancreatitis is lipase elevation begins 4 to 8 hours after the primary insult, and it peaks in 1 day, but it comes back to baseline only in 1 to 2 weeks. So if it's recurrent pancreatitis, we cannot use lipase as a marker. Amylase comes back to normal in 4 days. So if you are suspecting recurrent pancreatitis, do not ask for lipase, ask for amylase. So that's about lipase and pancreatitis. How about ceruloplasmin and hepatolenticular degeneration? That's a perfect combination because hepatolenticular degeneration is nothing but Wilson's disease. And we know Wilson's disease is caused by the defect of ATP7B gene present in chromosome 13. And ATP7B gene codes for a protein which is responsible for secreting copper from liver into the biliary canaliculi. Thereafter, the copper gets incorporated into copper-dependent enzymes. So many a times I've asked you what are the copper-dependent enzymes. The first one which you should remember is ceruloplasmin, which is a ferrioxidase. Second one is complex 4 of electron transport chain, which is cytochrome oxidase. And then we have dopamine beta hydroxylase, superoxide dismutase, tyrosinase. So these 5 enzymes we should remember as copper dependent enzymes. So when that ATP7B is defective, copper cannot come out of liver, copper accumulates in liver. And that causes liver damage, which presents itself as jaundice, hepatomegaly, and then it progresses to liver cirrhosis. And free copper is in the circulation. It overflows from the liver to systemic circulation. So free copper is available in circulation. That gets deposited in basal ganglia. And basal ganglia copper accumulation is the reason for neuropsychiatric manifestations of Wilson's. Copper accumulation decimates membrane of cornea, is responsible for Kayser-Fleischer ring in cornea. Okay. And if you're asked about diagnosis of Wilson's disease, as I told you, to start with, ceruloplasmin value. Yeah, ceruloplasmin level will be low. In Wilson's disease. But using ceruloplasmin as a marker for Wilson's is questionable. Reason is ceruloplasmin is an inflammatory marker. And Wilson's is an inflammatory condition. So actually we expect ceruloplasmin level to be low, but because of the inflammation it will be high. So many a time ceruloplasmin level will be in the normal range even in a frank case of Wilson's disease. That is why we don't stop with ceruloplasmin estimation. We also estimate free copper levels in urine, which will be high in Wilson's disease. And the gold standard for diagnosing Wilson's would be a liver biopsy and checking copper level in the tissue. And if the copper level in liver tissue is more than 100 microgram per gram of tissue, it is diagnostic of Wilson's. Okay, so we know that B is true, C is also true. Ceruloplasmin is of course a marker in hepatolenticular degeneration or Wilson's disease. And LDH1 is to LDH2 ratio. About this, LDH2 is an enzyme present in RBCs. LDH1 is present in myocardial cells. And normally LDH2 level is high. And in myocardial infarction, LDH1 level will be elevated. This is called as flipped pattern of LDH. So normally LDH2 is to 1 ratio will be high. But if you find that LDH1 is to 2 ratio is high, then that's called as flipped pattern of LDH. That's observed in myocardial infarction. So which of the following is or are the right combinations? We have 3 answers here, B, C and D. Okay. Let's discuss the third question. Mechanism involved in RNA interference is. So interestingly, there are 2 questions related to interference in the latest INI set July 2021 session. So one is this, the other one is about siRNAs bind to which part of mRNA. So let me answer those 2 questions in a single shot. So first about RNA interference. We have exogenous interference phenomenon and endogenous interference phenomenon. Let me tell you about endogenous interference. So when I say endogenous interference, we know that siRNAs are coded by specific genes. So the first step is those genes on transcription by RNA polymerase II would synthesize something called as pri-miRNA. And this is how a pri-miRNA would look. Pri is primary. Mi is microRNA, like primary transcript, it's pri-miRNA. Now this pri-miRNA will be processed within the nucleus by DROSHA to remove the overhanging edges to form a small hairpin loop. And this small hairpin loop is called as pre-miRNA. And this pre-miRNA comes out of the nucleus through exportin and it reaches the cytoplasm. And in cytoplasm, Dicer, an enzyme, processes this pre-miRNA to form double-stranded siRNA. So all that it has done is it has removed this loop. Once the loop is removed, it becomes a double-stranded siRNA. Then a helicase converts a double-stranded siRNA to 2 single strands. Then the antisense siRNA will try to find complementary sequences on any of the fully formed mRNAs. So if these siRNAs find complementary sequences on any of the fully formed mRNAs, let me show mRNAs in black color. So these mRNAs are formed from some other gene, right? So these mRNAs would have a 5' end and a 3' end. And in these mRNAs, there will be a coding region. And coding region will be the coding region will be enclosed or will be bracketed by untranslated regions, 5' untranslated regions and 3' untranslated regions. And these single stranded siRNAs go and bind to 3' untranslated regions of fully formed mRNAs. And if there is an exact complementarity here, this would recruit RNA transcription silencing complex. This recruits RNA transcription silencing complex, which comes with an endonuclease. And this endonuclease makes multiple nicks on the fully formed mRNA. Once the mRNA is fragmented, it cannot be expressed. So what we have done here is we have interfered with gene expression. And we have interfered with gene expression at mRNA level. Yeah, so this is called as gene knockdown. Why do we call it as knockdown? Because we have down regulated gene expression. So in what way is this gene knockdown different from gene knockout? So the difference between gene knockdown and knockout are very simple. Knockdown is a temporary down regulation of gene expression. Okay, knockdown is a temporary down regulation of gene expression which happens at RNA level. Why am I saying it's temporary? Because you have only interfered with mRNA getting converted to protein. Still there is a gene, and that gene in due course will start producing fresh mRNAs. Those fresh mRNAs will start producing protein. So this down regulation is a temporary down regulation, whereas gene knockout is a permanent change. It's a permanent change in the gene expression because it happens at the DNA level. So how do you think you are able to do this at DNA level? Because this is brought out by CRISPR. So we all know about CRISPR. You know, CRISPR is something which is very fascinating these days because diagnostics, therapeutics, everything is now centered around this CRISPR. So I feel you will have to know about CRISPR. So what is CRISPR? CRISPR is clustered, regularly interspersed, regularly interspersed short palindromic repeats. So CRISPR is abbreviated as clustered, regularly interspersed short palindromic repeats. So a CRISPR sequence or a CRISPR system has got two parts. One part is a small guiding RNA. I'm telling you about CRISPR system. It has got two parts. One is small guiding RNA, and that will be attached to a Cas enzyme. It is attached to a Cas enzyme. Here I am going to tell you about Cas9 enzyme. So what does this CRISPR system do? The small guiding RNA that is present in this system would try to find out complementary sequences. Yeah, it tries to find out complementary sequences on the double-stranded DNA. Suppose they find complementary sequence here, they go and hybridize here. Yeah, they go and hybridize here, after which Cas9 will start cleaving this provided they find a PAM sequence nearby. So what is a PAM sequence? Let me show PAM sequence in blue color. Yeah, it's a motif. PAM sequence is a motif which is supposed to be found close to this target sequence. If only PAM sequence is found, the Cas9 will start cleaving it. And once it is cleaved, we have a repair mechanism called as non-homologous end joining repair. We call it as non-homologous end joining repair. So once it is cut, you know there will be two ends. And these two ends will be joined by this repair mechanism, and this repair mechanism is prone to defects. So whenever there is a defect, that gene will be completely silenced. So what we have done here is the DNA is silenced forever. So we call that as gene knockout. So the basic difference between gene knockdown and gene knockout is, the name tells you gene knockdown is a temporary down regulation of gene expression happening at the RNA level. This is done by siRNAs. Whereas gene knockout is a permanent change in the gene expression because it happens at the DNA level, and that's done by CRISPR-Cas9 system. And about CRISPR-Cas9 system, it is very specific because there are two places wherein specificity is introduced. One is the small guiding RNA has to be very specific to the sequence which you are targeting, number one. Number two is the CRISPR has to find, the Cas9 enzyme has to find the PAM sequence. So it's a very specific change that can happen on a DNA. So what it does is the CRISPR-Cas9 enzyme would make a cleavage, will break it into two fragments, after which the joining is done by non-homologous end joining repair, which is prone to mutation. When there are mutations, that gene gets completely silenced. So that is about gene knockdown and gene knockout. So what is the answer here? Mechanism involved in RNA interference is gene knockdown. Had the question been mechanism involved in CRISPR, your answer should be gene knockout. Now the next question is, miRNA exhibits its effects by binding to. I have already given you the answer to this question. It binds to 3' untranslated region of mRNA. So the next question, question number 5. All of the following inhibit cytochrome oxidase except. So when we discussed the first question, I was telling you copper dependent enzyme. One of the enzymes is cytochrome oxidase, which is complex 4. So they are asking you which of all of the following would inhibit complex 4 except. So before we discuss answer to this question, let me tell you about complexes of electron transport chain. So complex 1, electrons move from complex 1 to Q, and from Q they go to complex 3. From 3 they go to complex C, from C to 4, and from 4 to oxygen. And complex 2 also sends its electron directly to Q. So this is the direction of transport of electron. So if the question is, which of the following inhibits electron transport from complex 1 to Q? Yeah, you know the first alphabet is A, and inhibitors of electron transport from 1 to Q, all those names have got something to do with A. So the first name is amobarbital. The name starts with A. Second one is pyrisidin A. Yeah, pyrisidin A ends with A. And the third one is rotenone. How is it related to A? Yeah, rotenone sounds like vitamin A, right? Yeah, retinol, retinol. It's not vitamin A, just for you to remember. So electron transport between complex 1 and Q, there are 3 inhibitors. All 3 names start with them and have got something to do with A. Amobarbital, pyrisidin A, and rotenone. Now complex 2 of electron transport chain is nothing but succinate dehydrogenase, that is inhibited by malonate. And electron transport between 2 and Q is inhibited. Transport between 2 and Q is inhibited by TTFA and carboxin. For remembrance, 2, the letter 2 starts with T. So 2 to Q is inhibited by TTFA and carboxin. Electron transport between 3 and C is inhibited by BAL and antimycin. Yeah, between 3 and C is inhibited by BAL and antimycin. Please remember this has got A, so don't get confused with complex 1. Yeah, between 3 and C is inhibited by BAL and antimycin. Now complex 4 to oxygen is inhibited by common poisons including hydrogen sulfide, cyanide, and carbon monoxide. And about carbon monoxide, this is not the basic principle of its toxicity. Main reason behind carbon monoxide poisoning is that it has got very high affinity to Fe2 plus of hemoglobin. So it dissociates oxygen away. It basically decreases the oxygen carrying capacity of hemoglobin. And apart from that, it also inhibits electron transport between 4 and oxygen. So cytochrome oxidase electron transport is inhibited by hydrogen sulfide, cyanide, and carbon monoxide. So all except answer would be D, methane. Now sideroblastic anemia is treated by, it's a very interesting question. First let me tell you what are sideroblasts. So sideroblasts are premature RBCs. They are nucleated RBCs. Okay, and ring sideroblasts mean these premature RBCs have iron-laden macrophages. They have iron-laden macrophages arranged around the nucleus like a ring. And when do you think iron-laden macrophages will be found? Only when iron cannot be incorporated into heme. When do you think iron cannot be incorporated into heme? Whenever heme synthesis is disordered. Whenever there is a defect of heme synthesis, the protoporphyrin ring is not formed properly. That is when iron cannot get incorporated into the protoporphyrin. So the excess iron would accumulate in mitochondria and that would surround nucleus forming ring sideroblasts. So sideroblastic anemia is observed whenever there is heme synthesis disorder. So it can be congenital or acquired. If it's congenital, it is caused by complete defect of the first enzyme of heme synthesis, which is ALA synthase. And because this ALA synthase gene is present in X chromosome, ALA synthase defect causes X-linked sideroblastic anemia. So if you are asking me why not other heme synthetic pathway defect cause, why not other defects cause sideroblastic anemia? Because all the other defects are partial defects. When all those are partial defects, one way or the other, they finally synthesize protoporphyrin, iron gets incorporated. So the only one enzyme defect which is complete in heme synthesis is ALA synthase defect. So that ALA synthase defect causes X-linked sideroblastic anemia. And what are the acquired causes? Because ALA synthase is basically a decarboxylase, ALA synthase needs B6 acids coenzyme. Please remember, B6 or pyridoxal phosphate is necessary as a coenzyme for transamination reactions and decarboxylation reactions. And because ALA synthase step involves decarboxylation, it needs pyridoxal phosphate. So B6 deficiency will cause sideroblastic anemia. Okay, so answer is it's treated by B6. Deficiency of tetrahydrofolate is observed in the deficiency of. I know you all know the answer. Yeah, it's called as methylfolate trap caused by B12 deficiency. So all that you need to know here is methyl tetrahydrofolate. We know that tetrahydrofolate is a one carbon carrier. That is, it carries one carbon derivatives like methyl, methylene, methanol from one source to another product. So one of the one carbon derivatives of tetrahydrofolate is methyl tetrahydrofolate, and this methyl tetrahydrofolate has got a very low group transfer potential, and it can transfer its methyl group only to B12, forming methyl B12. And this methyl B12 acts as a coenzyme for methionine synthase. And this methionine synthase helps in the conversion of homocysteine to methionine. Then this methionine is converted to S-adenosyl methionine, and S-adenosyl methionine is necessary for transmethylation reactions. So what happens in B12 deficiency? In B12 deficiency, methyl tetrahydrofolate cannot donate its methyl group to B12. So all tetrahydrofolate will be trapped as methyl tetrahydrofolate, and this causes a functional deficiency of tetrahydrofolate. Only when there is free tetrahydrofolate, it can form methylene tetrahydrofolate, it can form methanyl tetrahydrofolate, and all those tetrahydrofolate derivatives have got their own purposes, their own functions. But in B12 deficiency, because methyl tetrahydrofolate cannot donate its methyl group to B12, all tetrahydrofolate will be trapped as methyl tetrahydrofolate. This is called as methylfolate trap. So deficiency of tetrahydrofolate is observed in the deficiency of B12. So this question has been discussed in the Telegram group. Almost all questions have been discussed in the Telegram group. This we discussed specifically as one question. So 5-alpha reductase deficiency causes what? So what is the main function of 5-alpha reductase? It helps in the conversion of testosterone to dihydroxytestosterone. And what is the use of dihydroxytestosterone? It helps in supporting male type external genitalia to get established. It is necessary for male type external genitalia to get established. About the cells which are related to external genitalial development in male, their receptors have got high affinity for dihydroxytestosterone than to testosterone. So at the time of birth or just before birth, only when there is dihydroxytestosterone, male type of external genitalia can be established. If it's not available, by default it will develop as a female. So in 5-alpha reductase deficiency, because the infant does not have dihydroxytestosterone, because in utero there is no dihydroxytestosterone, male type external genitalia does not get established. So by default female type external genitalia is established. So at the time of birth the child will look like a female in spite of the child having XY chromosome. Okay, so it's a male with female type external genitalia. So we call it as male pseudohermaphroditism. But what happens at the time of puberty? the same person at the time of puberty will have testosterone surges. So when the concentration of testosterone is high, the reduced affinity of the testosterone for the receptor will be overcome, and this testosterone will then start acting on external genitalial cells to support male type development. So penis is developed at the age of 12. So we call this condition as penis at 12 syndrome. Yeah, we call this condition as penis at 12 syndrome. So if you are asked penis at 12 syndrome is caused by what, your answer should be 5-alpha reductase deficiency, and 5-alpha reductase deficiency causes male type pseudohermaphroditism, because in this case chromosomal sex is male because the child has got XY, but external genitalia looks like a female. Which fusion exocytosis complex is affected by tetanospasmin? So it's very interesting when you compare tetanospasmin and botulinum toxin. So both tetanospasmin and botulinum toxin act by interfering with the docking step, and docking is a step which is related to neurotransmitter release. So ultimately both these toxins inhibit neurotransmitter release. So the question is, if both inhibit neurotransmitter release, why is it that tetanospasmin causes spastic paralysis whereas botulinum toxin causes flaccid paralysis? It is because of the way our upper motor neuron and lower motor neuron work. Yeah, suppose this is a muscle. We know every muscle is supplied by a lower motor neuron or alpha motor neuron. And this lower motor neuron or alpha motor neuron releases acetylcholine, which binds on NM receptors of neuromuscular junction that causes contraction. And this lower motor neuron is always under the inhibitory control of upper motor neuron. And we know that this upper motor neuron starts from the contralateral side cerebral cortex, right? It goes through corona radiata, midbrain, pons, medulla. Then it decussates to the opposite side and it ends here. So this is upper motor neuron, this is lower motor neuron. Upper motor neuron is inhibitory, so it releases GABA and glycine. Okay, so how do these toxins act? So both botulinum toxin and tetanus toxin enter into the nervous system only through the peripheral nerves. So both these get into the peripheral nerve endings, in the sense lower motor neuron endings. After they enter here, if it's botulinum toxin, yeah, botulinum toxin inhibits the docking step by interfering with two V-SNAR proteins. V stands for vesicle, yeah, V-SNAR proteins, syntaxin and SNAP25. Yeah, SNAP25. So botulinum toxin interferes with docking step by inhibiting V-SNAR proteins, namely syntaxin and SNAP25. So they do not allow acetylcholine to be released into the neuromuscular junction. And without acetylcholine, there can be no contraction that causes flaccid paralysis. Okay, this is about botulinum toxin. Now, how about tetanus toxin? Tetanospasmin also gets into the nervous system through lower motor neuron endings. Let me show that in green color. So they also get into the nervous system through lower motor neuron endings, but after they get into lower motor neurons, they do not interfere with acetylcholine release, but they utilize the retrograde axonal transport to reach the soma of lower motor neurons. And by budding mechanism, they get released out of these soma, and then they are taken up by upper motor neuron endings. And then upper motor neuron endings, they interfere with the docking step. And here they interfere with synaptobrevin. They also interfere with B-SNAR protein called as synaptobrevin. So acting here, what do they inhibit? They inhibit GABA release and glycine release. So what is removed? The inhibition on lower motor neuron is removed. So that causes excessive acetylcholine release, and that causes spastic paralysis. Yeah, so the carry home message here is both tetanospasmin and botulinum toxin interfere with docking step. They interfere with neurotransmitter release. The difference is tetanospasmin causes spastic paralysis because tetanospasmin inhibits the release of GABA and glycine from upper motor neuron endings, and they interfere with synaptobrevin. Botulinum toxin inhibits the release of acetylcholine from lower motor neuron endings because it interferes with syntaxin and SNAP25. So what is the answer to this question? The question is about tetanospasmin. So what does it interfere with? It causes lysis of synaptobrevin, which is a VSNAP protein, which is related to GABA and glycine release from upper motor neuron endings. So the most accepted method for HbA1c estimation is, this is a frequently asked question. HbA1c or glycated hemoglobin can be estimated by affinity chromatography. It can be estimated by ion exchange chromatography, immunoturbidimetry, capillary electrophoresis, and even by enzymatic method. Okay, so all these 5 methods are available in the market currently. But if you are asked which is the reference method, if the question is which is the reference method, it is ion exchange chromatography. Reason being the DCCT trial, diabetes control and complication trial, based on which all target goals are established. Therapeutic target goals for diabetes is established based on this DCCT trial. And in this DCCT trial, the method that was used for HbA1c estimation is ion exchange chromatography. To be very specific, it is cation exchange chromatography. And this is based on the fact that HbA1c or glycated hemoglobin is positively charged. So when the hemolysate of the person is passed through the column, only the positively charged glycated hemoglobin will be held on to the stationary phase, everything else will be eluted down. And then we change the pH of the buffer to remove the glycated hemoglobin later, and then we estimate it. And we express it as percentage. So that is cation exchange chromatography or ion exchange chromatography, which is considered as the reference method. But then we have all the other methods which are available in market, and all of these are reliable because all these are harmonized or standardized against the DCCT values. Okay, but if you are asked which is the reference method or the accepted method, your answer should be ion exchange chromatography. Patient presented to emergency with a suspected acid-base disorder. Which of the following tests can be done to diagnose the disorder? So whenever there is a suspected acid-base disorder, we have always been told that we do arterial blood gas analysis. But the interesting aspect is you need arterial blood gas analysis only when you want to check oxygenation status of the person. Only when you have a suspicion about the respiratory system of the person, you want to find out whether there is an obstruction defect or a diffusion defect. In that case, you will have to say, no, I want arterial blood gas analysis. Otherwise, if you want to just find out if there is an acid-base disorder, venous blood sample is equally good. Because venous pH and arterial pH vary very minimally. And venous total carbon dioxide content and arterial total carbon dioxide content also vary minimally. Probably by 4 milli equivalents per liter is the maximum difference between the two. Only the oxygen, venous oxygen content and venous and arterial oxygen content will be totally different. So the carry home message here is, if you want to assess the oxygenation status of a person, then you ask for arterial blood gas analysis. But if you want to just check acid-base disorder in a person, venous blood sample is equally good. And be it arterial blood sample or venous blood sample, just looking at the pH will not tell you anything, because many a times pH might look normal, but when bicarbonate and PCO2 are affected, it means the person is suffering from acid-base disorder, because in mixed acid-base disorders, pH managed to remain normal. Okay, so these are the facts which you should have in mind. Now let's look at choices. Okay, now just by looking at arterial pH, will you be able to find out an acid-base disorder? Not always. If it's a mixed acid-base disorder, it will go unnoticed if you just look at arterial pH. Okay, now how about venous oxygen content? As I said, venous oxygen partial pressure. Partial pressure of oxygen in the venous blood sample is just 40 millimeter of mercury, whereas in the arterial blood sample, partial pressure of oxygen is 95 millimeter of mercury. So that much the difference is. Okay, so the only drawback of using venous blood sample is you won't be able to assess oxygen status. So this cannot be used. And because they have specified that more than one choice may be correct, I would choose B and D. Yeah, I would choose B and D because just by looking at a venous blood samples pH and just by looking at venous total carbon dioxide content, I will be able to find out if there is any acid base disorder. So answer for this question is B and D. RBCs use which of the following in starvation? Yeah, this I think everybody knows. RBCs do not have mitochondria. The first point which you need to know to answer this question is RBCs do not have mitochondria, so they cannot undergo aerobic metabolism. And the only pathway which can generate ATP anaerobically is glycolysis. It's anaerobic glycolysis, which means the only fuel an anaerobic cell can utilize is glucose. So RBCs always utilize glucose irrespective of whether the person is in starvation or in a fed state. Okay, so answer to this question is very simple. It is D. Now the last question, insulin inhibits which of the following? Hormone sensitive lipase, lipoprotein lipase, pancreatic lipase and gastric lipase. I'll just tell you about hormone sensitive lipase. One word about this enzyme, you will tell me the answer. Hormone sensitive lipase is an enzyme which is present in adipose tissue. And the function of hormone sensitive lipase is to cleave adipose tissue triacylglycerol to form glycerol and fatty acid. And both glycerol and fatty acid then would leave adipose tissue, would reach circulation. Through circulation, it would reach liver. In a single sentence, if you're asking me what is the function of hormone sensitive lipase, I would say it's a catabolic enzyme which causes lipolysis in adipose tissue. And because we know insulin is an anabolic hormone, what do you think will be the effect of insulin on hormone sensitive lipase? Insulin inhibits hormone sensitive lipase. Yeah, insulin inhibits hormone sensitive lipase, whereas all counter regulatory hormones of insulin. What are the counter regulatory hormones of insulin? Glucagon, growth hormone, norepinephrine, cortisol. So all these counter regulatory hormones of insulin, they are all catabolic, so they all stimulate hormone sensitive lipase. So now do you understand the reason behind the name hormone sensitive lipase? It is only to tell you that it is sensitive to inhibition by insulin and it is sensitive to stimulation by all counter regulatory hormones. Okay, so insulin inhibits which of the following? Hormone sensitive lipase. And please remember, lipoprotein lipase is an anabolic enzyme, because what does this lipoprotein lipase do? Lipoprotein lipase is an enzyme which is clinging to the vessel wall. And its main function is to act on lipoproteins triacylglycerol. We know we have chylomicron, VLDL, yeah. So all these lipoproteins carry triacylglycerol, and the function of lipoprotein lipase is to act on triacylglycerol of lipoproteins. And because lipoproteins are found only in circulation, this enzyme should also be clinging to the vessel wall. Okay, and what does this enzyme do? It acts on triacylglycerol, cleaves it to give glycerol and fatty acid. And all these fatty acids will cross all membranes, will get into extrahepatic tissues, wherein they are stored as triacylglycerol. So this is the way a body gets exposed to, or a body gets to store dietary triacylglycerol. So it's basically an anabolic enzyme. If it's an anabolic enzyme, insulin will stimulate it. So answer is insulin inhibits hormone sensitive lipase and it stimulates lipoprotein lipase. So that's all about the 13 questions asked in INI set. All the best for your NEET PG 2021. The carry home message is, if you're consistent in whatever you're doing, you'll be able to succeed in life. Yeah, thank you.